In 1890, a logging camp cook in Michigan fed 60 men breakfast in total silence. Talking at the table was forbidden. A man who asked out loud for the molasses could be sent back to the bunkhouse hungry. Most people picture lumberjacks eating steaks by a fire. The truth was stranger and a lot heavier. Number 14 on this list packed so many calories into one greasy serving it could fuel a man through a whole morning of swinging an axe in the snow. And number 3 was so prized that camp cooks guarded it like gold. These men burned 8,000 calories a day. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 20 brutal foods lumberjacks wolfed down before felling trees at dawn. Number 20. Hardtack. Before a supply sled could reach a deep woods camp, before fresh flour was anything but a memory, there was hardtack. These were squares of flour and water baked until every drop of moisture was gone, so hard that men called them tooth dullers and sheet iron. A cracker could ride in a wool coat pocket for a month and come out exactly as it went in. Lumberjacks soaked them in hot coffee or bean broth until they softened enough to chew without cracking a molar. The taste was nothing, just chalk and salt, but a single dense cracker delivered the kind of slow-burning calories a man needed at 5 in the morning. When the snow buried the supply road and the wagons could not get through, hardtack was the only thing standing between a crew and an empty stomach. The men complained, then reached for another piece. Number 19. Salt pork. The backbone of every logging camp arrived in wooden barrels packed in brine. Salt pork, the heavily cured belly and side of a hog, could survive an entire winter without spoiling, and it went into almost everything. The cook sliced it thick, fried it until the fat rendered out crisp, then used those drippings to cook the beans, the potatoes, and the gravy. Nothing was wasted. By the 1880s, a barrel of salt pork was one of the largest single costs a camp foreman wrote into his ledger because every man ate it twice a day. The meat was brutally salty, fatty, and monotonous, but that was the point. The fat was fuel. A man swinging a crosscut saw in 20 below cold needed grease the way a stove needs wood, and salt pork delivered it by the pound, meal after meal, week after week. Number 18. Sourdough flapjacks. The men called them stove lids, and a good cook could turn out a stack the size of a dinner plate. The sourdough starter was the single most guarded thing in the cook shanty, a crock of fermented flour and water that the cook kept warm overnight so the wild yeast would not die in the cold. Every morning he ladled out a portion, mixed it with flour and a pinch of soda, and poured it onto a griddle slick with bacon grease. The cakes came off thick, tangy, and gold, and a logger would stack 6 or 8 of them, drown the whole tower in molasses, and finish it before the man beside him said a word. A camp of 40 men could go through hundreds of flapjacks before sunup. When a starter died from the cold, it was treated as a genuine disaster. Number 17. Salt cod. Out in a winter camp, fresh fish was a fantasy, but salt cod traveled like a board and lasted like one too. The men gave it a name dripping with sarcasm. They called it Cape Cod turkey. Hard, dried, and stiff as shingle, the cod had to be soaked overnight to draw out the salt before the cook could do anything with it. Then he would flake it into a thick white gravy made from flour, drippings, and whatever milk could be reconstituted from a can, and ladle the whole pale mess over biscuits or boiled potatoes. It was Friday food in many camps, a nod to old habits the men brought from home. The flavor was strong and briny, more salt than fish, but it was protein that did not need a barn or a butcher, and on a long drive that was worth more than taste. Number 16. Stewed prunes. The men called them logging berries, and they said it with a straight face. Fresh fruit could not survive the trip into the woods, but dried prunes packed into burlap sacks could ride a sled for months without complaint. The cook would simmer them in water with a little sugar until they plumped up soft and dark, and serve them warm at the end of a meal or cold out of a crock for breakfast. After weeks of salt pork and beans, that small sweetness hit like a holiday. There was a practical reason too, one nobody discussed politely. A diet built almost entirely on fat, beans, and bread did terrible things to a man's digestion, and stewed prunes kept the whole crew running. A box of dried fruit was cheap, traveled well, and earned its place in the supply list twice over. Number 15. Red Horse. When the men saw a platter of corned beef coming, they called it Red Horse, half insult and half affection. Beef that arrived fresh in camp had to be used fast or cured fast, and curing in brine turned it that deep, unnatural pink that gave the dish its name. The cook boiled it slow with onions until a tough, cheap cut went tender enough to pull apart, and served it in slabs with boiled potatoes and cabbage when he had them. It was a heavier, meatier meal than the daily beans, the kind of supper that told a crew the foreman was in a good mood or the season was going well. Men who had eaten nothing but pork for a month attacked Red Horse like it was a feast, scraping every drop of the salty broth off their tin plates with a heel of bread. Number 14. Sinkers. Here is the one that ran on pure calories. Sinkers were donuts, deep-fried rounds of sweetened dough dropped into a kettle of bubbling lard until they puffed up brown and heavy, and the men loved them more than almost anything the cook made. The name came from how they sat in your gut like an anchor, and that was exactly the point. A single sinker was a fist of fried fat and sugar, and a logger could put away half a dozen with his morning coffee and not think twice. Each one delivered the kind of dense, immediate energy a man needed before he walked out into the dark to swing an axe in the snow for 10 hours. Making them took time and a lot of lard, so when word spread that the cook was frying sinkers, the whole camp moved a little faster. They were the closest thing to a treat the woods could offer, and the men inhaled them. Here is where the truth about logging camp food gets interesting. The most important man in a winter camp was not the foreman, and it was not the strongest sawyer. It was the cook. He woke at 3 in the morning, worked past dark, and held the entire morale of 40 exhausted men in his hands. A bad cook could break a camp. Crews quit over thin beans and burnt coffee, and a foreman who lost his cook in January was in serious trouble. The cook ruled the dining shanty like a small kingdom, and his strangest law was silence. In most camps, talking at the table was flatly forbidden. Men shoveled food in fast and wordless, pointing at what they wanted, because a quiet table meant a quick table, and a quick table meant the cook could clean up and start cooking again. He fed an army 4 times a day with no electricity, no refrigeration, and a wood stove, and the men knew better than to cross him. Number 13. Hash. Nothing in a logging camp ever truly got thrown away, and hash was the proof. Leftover corned beef, cold boiled potatoes, scraps of onion, and whatever else was hanging around the shanty got chopped fine, pressed into a hot greased skillet, and fried until the bottom built up a dark, crusted layer the men prized above all else. The cook would flip sections of it over so both sides crisped, then scrape it onto the plates steaming. It was different every single morning depending on what the day before had left behind, and that small variety was a gift in a place where most meals never changed. Hash turned yesterday's supper into today's breakfast and stretched the food budget without anyone going hungry. A man could fill up on it for almost nothing, and the cook looked like a magician for making real food out of leftovers. Number 12. Baking powder biscuits. When there was no time to wait for sourdough to rise, the cook reached for baking powder, and in 20 minutes the shanty smelled like a bakery. He cut lard into flour, salt, and a heavy hand of baking powder, splashed in milk or water, and dropped the dough in rough mounds onto a sheet to bake in the Dutch oven or the big iron range. They came out fast, hot, and flaky, and the men used them for everything. They split them and drowned them in gravy. They sopped up bean broth with them. They stuffed cold ones in their coat pockets to eat out on the cut when the morning got long. A skilled cook could turn out dozens at a time, and on a crew that ran on bread the way an engine runs on coal, that speed was everything. No rising, no waiting, just hot biscuits whenever the men needed bulk. Number 11. Pea soup. Brought into the North Woods by French-Canadian crews, thick yellow PEA soup became one of the most reliable meals in any camp. The cook soaked a sack of dried split peas overnight, then simmered them all day with a piece of salt pork and an onion, until the peas dissolved into a heavy golden porridge you could almost stand a spoon in. It was cheap beyond belief. It forgave a cook who had to leave the stove to do something else, and it only got better as it thickened. The salt pork gave up its smoke and fat into the pot, and by supper the soup tasted far richer than its handful of ingredients had any right to. A bowl of pea soup and a few biscuits could carry a man through an afternoon of brutal work, and it cost the camp next to nothing to make. Number 10. Mush. When supplies ran thin near the end of a long season, mush kept the crew alive. The cook boiled cornmeal or oats in water until it thickened into a heavy porridge, then served it plain or, on a good day, with molasses and a knob of grease stirred through. It was filling in the way only hot starch can be, sitting low and warm in the stomach and burning slow through a cold morning. Leftover mush was poured into a pan, left to set firm overnight, then sliced and fried in lard for breakfast as fried mush, which the men actually looked forward to because frying gave it a crisp edge and a little flavor. It was humble food, the kind that showed up when the meat was gone and the wagons were late, but it did its job. It filled men up and sent them out the door able to work. Number 9. Cackleberries. Eggs were a luxury in a deep woods camp, and the men gave them a name as ridiculous as their value. They called them cackleberries. Eggs were fragile. They did not travel well over frozen roads, and they spoiled, so a crate of them arriving in camp was something close to an event. The cook fried them in pork grease or scrambled them by the dozens, and they vanished off the tin plates in seconds. Sometimes he stretched them by scrambling them into hash or folding them into a heavy batter to make more cakes go further. For men whose protein came mostly from salt-cured fat and dried beans, the richness of real eggs was a small jolt of something that tasted like home. When the cook announced cackleberries for breakfast, the bunkhouse emptied fast, and nobody had to be told twice to come to the table. Number 8. Murphy's. The men called potatoes Murphy's, and they ate them by the bushel. Potatoes stored well in a cold camp cellar, they were cheap by the hundredweight, and they could be cooked a dozen ways without anyone getting truly sick of them. The favorite was sliced thick and fried low and slow in bacon grease with onions until the edges crisped up golden, and the whole skillet smelled like supper. The potatoes drank up the fat as they cooked and turned into something far better than a plain boiled spud. Other days, they were boiled to go under the corned beef, mashed to soak up gravy, or chopped into the morning hash. For a working man burning thousands of calories before noon, a plate of fried Murphy's was simple, cheap fuel that never ran out, and a camp that kept its cellar full never had to watch a crew go hungry. Second pattern break. Here is what the math actually looked like. A lumberjack working a full winter day in the cold burned somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 calories, and on the worst days even more. That is 2 or 3 times what a modern man eats, and it had to come in fast and stay with him. This is why everything they ate was so heavy, so greasy, so unapologetically built around fat and starch. The salt pork, the lard-fried sinkers, the molasses on everything, the biscuits drowned in gravy. It was not a diet anyone designed to be pleasant. It was engineering. A camp that fed its men thin food got thin work out of them, and a foreman knew it. The strange, brutal richness of this food was not gluttony. It was the only way to keep a man strong enough to swing an axe for 10 hours in the snow and come back the next morning ready to do it again. Number 7. Long sweetening. Molasses was the liquid gold of the cook shanty, and the men called it long sweetening, or larup. It traveled forever. It never went bad, and it made everything more bearable. It went over the flapjacks, into the beans, across the mush, stirred into coffee, and poured straight onto a biscuit when nothing else was around. A barrel of dark, thick blackstrap was a standard line on every supply list because it did two jobs at once. It made monotonous food taste like something, and it delivered quick, cheap energy in a form that kept all winter. The men loved it the way they loved few things in camp, and a cook learned to guard the barrel because a logger would happily sneak a spoonful when no one was looking. In a place where sugar was scarce and candy was non-existent, a stream of dark molasses was as close to a sweet tooth's heaven as the woods ever got. Number 6. Tea. While coffee got most of the glory, plenty of camps, especially the French-Canadian crews, ran on tea instead, and they drank it strong enough to walk on its own. The cook brewed it black and bitter in a giant pot and kept it hot from before dawn until the night was over. Out on the cut, far from the shanty, the men carried it in tin pails and reheated it over a small fire at midday, sometimes calling that muddy, lukewarm midday brew swamp water with a grin. It was hot, it was free, and it was the only thing besides the work itself that kept a man's blood moving and killing cold. A logger soaked through with sweat and snow could wrap his hands around a hot tin of tea and feel like a human being again for 5 minutes before he picked his axe back up. Number 5. Boiled dinner. When a camp had a little fresh beef and a foreman feeling generous, the cook made a boiled dinner, and the whole shanty knew good food was coming. A piece of corned or fresh beef went into the biggest pot, and around it went potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and carrots. Everything simmered together for hours until the meat fell apart and the vegetables soaked up the salty, beefy broth. It was a one-pot feast that filled the cook's load down to a single kettle, and it gave the men real vegetables, which were rare enough in the woods to feel like medicine. The broth at the bottom of the pot was almost the best part, salty and rich, perfect for dunking bread. A boiled dinner was the kind of meal a man wrote home about, proof that the camp was eating well and the season was running right. Number 4. Coffee. Here is something people forget. Logging camps ran on coffee the way the saws ran on oil. The cook brewed it black, thick, and strong enough that a spoon nearly stood up in it, and he kept a pot going from 3 in the morning until the last man stumbled off to the bunkhouse. The men drank it by the quart, scalding hot, with a slug of molasses if they wanted it sweet. Out on the cut, a tin of cold coffee in a coat pocket was a midday lifeline. Coffee was not a comfort or a habit out there. It was a tool. It thawed a man out, it dragged him awake before sunrise, and it carried him through the dead afternoon hours when his body wanted to quit. A camp that ran out of coffee had a near mutiny on its hands, and every cook knew it. Nothing on the supply list was guarded more carefully. Third pattern break. Here is what the cook understood that no one wrote down. The food was never really about the food. A camp full of cold, sore, exhausted men, weeks from home and buried in snow, was held together at the dinner table. A heaping plate of beans, a tower of flapjacks soaked in molasses, a kettle of sinkers fresh out of the lard. Those were the things that made a brutal life bearable for one more day. The silence rule, the 4 meals, the bottomless coffee, all of it pointed at the same goal. Keep the men fed, keep the men strong, keep the men from walking off the job. The cook was not just feeding bodies, he was feeding morale, and he knew that a crew that ate well worked hard and stayed put, and a crew that ate poorly fell apart. The most important thing in the whole camp was not the timber. It was the next hot meal. Number 3. PIE. Here is the one the cook guarded like gold. Lumberjacks were famous for one demand above all others. They wanted pie, and a camp that did not serve pie could not keep men. A good cook turned out pies by the dozen, dried apple, raisin, custard, whatever the supply sled allowed, and the men devoured them at a rate that would shock anyone today. A logger might eat a quarter of a pie at a single sitting and consider it a normal portion. Pie was the reward at the end of a brutal day, the one thing on the table that existed purely for pleasure instead of fuel, and that made it priceless. A cook who baked good pie could write his own ticket from camp to camp. The men talked about a great pie cook the way other men talked about a great fighter, and a camp lucky enough to have one knew exactly how rich it was. Number 2, vinegar pie. When the dried apples ran out and the lemons that never existed stayed a fantasy, the cook still found a way to put pie on the table. Vinegar pie was the trick. He mixed vinegar, sugar, eggs, and flour into a filling that, once baked, came out tangy and smooth enough to fool a tired man into thinking he was eating something citrusy and bright. It used only pantry staples that lasted all winter, nothing fresh, nothing perishable, and it answered the men's endless hunger for pie when there was nothing else to bake one from. The acidity cut clean through weeks of heavy grease and salt, and to a crew starved for anything sharp and sweet, it tasted like a small miracle. It was pure frontier ingenuity, the cook refusing to let something as minor as having no fruit stand between his men and a slice of pie. Number 1, beanhole beans. At the top of the list is the meal that was the soul of every logging camp, and it was cooked in a hole in the ground. The night before, the cook lined a pit with stones, built a roaring fire in it, and let it burn down to glowing coals. Into a heavy iron pot went dried beans, a slab of salt pork, onions, and a long pour of molasses. The lid clamped down tight. He buried the whole pot in the coals, covered it with dirt, and left it overnight. By morning, the slow underground heat had worked a kind of magic, turning hard dried beans into something dark, sweet, smoky, and impossibly rich. The pork melted into the broth, and the molasses caramelized through every bean. Beanhole beans showed up day after day, all winter long, the one constant a logger could count on. Beans were cheap, they were filling, and cooked this way they tasted like far more than the pennies they cost. This was the meal that built the men who built the timber industry. They did not eat it because it was fancy. They ate it because it kept them alive, and because no cook in the North Woods ever made anything better. Here is my challenge. Pick one of these and try it this week. The beanhole beans, the sourdough flapjacks, or the vinegar pie. Then come back and tell me if these men were just surviving, or if they actually knew something about real food we have forgotten. Drop the one you are going to make in the comments. I want to know if the sinkers get more love than the pie, and whether anyone's family still cooks beans in the ground. Because these were not just camp meals, they were the fuel that cut down a forest.